I'm going to put a link to the pre-test in the chat so folks can go ahead and fill that out if they haven't already. For CEUs, we need a pre and post test, so we'll do the post test at the end, but there's a link to the pre-test there.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our Sexuality, Sex Education, and Disability Justice Workshop. This workshop is a part of SCSG's Sexuality and Disability series. So far we've done an intro to Disability Justice Live on Instagram, and we are currently accepting submissions for a Sexuality and Disability zine. More information on our website and our Instagram and Twitter. So topics like sex education and disability justice are often forgotten about in social work practice and curriculums. So today we have a Silberman professor and SCSG faculty associate Laura Graham Holmes moderating our panel with Morrigan Hunter and Katherine McLaughlin. We're also recording this workshop with the exception of a Q&A section. So if you are not comfortable with being shown on camera, turn it off if you would like. And now I'm going to turn it over to SJ, who will talk more about SCSG.
Hi, thank you, Anita. Welcome. I'm SJ Dodd. I am thrilled to be the founding director of SCSG, the Silberman Center for Sexuality and Gender, based at Silberman School of Social Work, Hunter College, New York City. And SCSG's focus is on research, education, and advocacy related to sex and sexuality, sort of broadly defined, and as well as gender. So we aim to promote sex-positive, gender-affirming social work related to social work practice, policy, and really focus on sex-positive, inclusive, affirming practice and policy initiatives. We have, as Anita mentioned, some wonderful faculty affiliates, including Laura Graham Holmes, who's our facilitator this evening and who coordinated some of to make this possible. And we also have, this year we have 4 CO interns, one of which is Anita. Crystal and Paige are also here, and Laurel, it couldn't be here today, but oh, Laurel, I see you. You are here. Great. And then we have former interns on the call, which is why I mentioned Gabriel earlier, who's also an adjunct professor at Silberman. And I think we have some alum on the call too, which is lovely. But yeah, so we are focused on research, education, and advocacy, really trying to elevate sex and sexuality and gender, especially within the biopsychosocial assessment, because the sexual dimension gets pushed aside or ignored, pressed down, not attended to. And so that's why events like this are super important, because they're really pressing to increase capacity building around sex-positive, gender-affirming practice. SCSG has a couple of initiatives going on, and I'm going to pass the baton to our fearless associate director, Jama Shelton, who is going to tell you about our TDOV initiative and a couple of other things maybe.
All right, awesome. Thank you, SJ. Thank you all for being here. So I want to tell you quickly about a couple things. One is SCSG is doing a digital campaign for Trans Day of Visibility to spread some love and support for our trans community members on Friday the 31st. If you've not yet taken the pledge to join us, I encourage you to do so, and I'm putting that in the chat right now. So that's a link to the pledge. When you take the pledge, we'll send you some information about how you can be involved on Friday. We also have, Anita is curating a sexuality and disability zine, and the deadline for submissions for that is March the 31st. So we have some more information about that for folks. And finally, something that's really cool is there's a lot of anti-trans legislation happening all over the country, as you may know. And there's a special issue for all of you academic nerds and non-academic nerds, is a special issue of the Journal of Sociology and Social Welfare that's coming out in the next couple of days that's specifically about social work education and anti-trans legislation and what we should be doing as a profession. So keep an eye out on our social media for that, because that's super exciting. And I think that's all I have for now. So I'm going to turn it back over to Anita to get us started.
And I'm going to turn to Laura and Morrigan and Katherine to start our presentation.
Thank you. So today we have a couple of presentations from Morrigan Hunter and Katherine McLaughlin, and then we're going to have a conversation together. We invite you to ask questions. You should have a little button down below in the More category, maybe called Q&A. You can put your questions there. I'll be looking there and in the chat to collect, questions, and whatever your interests and focus are, we're happy to speak to that. So I will let Morgan, do you mind introducing yourself and starting us off?
Sure. And then would you like me to do the screen share, or would you like to do that?
Are you set up to do it?
I can. Let me see.
Okay.
I've got it up, Morgan, if you want me to share.
Okay, I think I already have it here. So,
Okay.
All right. Hopefully that.
Yay.
Yay. I think that's working.
It says loading, but I think that is a good sign.
Yes, probably. All right. So, and then I think our introductions are kind of embedded in the slides. So I don't know if you want us to introduce ourselves before then. Or... All right. So yeah, this is the presentation that Katherine and I put together on sex ed and disability justice. So the first slide is on just kind of like a bit about like my backstory. So I'm multiply neurodivergent and disabled and a social worker. I use they and them pronouns. I grew up in Idaho. And I have a background in like cultural history and gender. So and like pre-modern Japan, which really I think informs a lot of how I look at stuff, and it helps me to kind of look at things from sort of a systems level. I think even before I went into social work, I feel like having that background in history has kind of inspired a lot of sort of my framework for thinking about things. I grew up in Idaho, and if you know anything about that state now, and back when I was a young person there, sex ed was abstinence only, fear-based, and then of course, like there was no recognition of the sorts of things I would need to know as the neurodivergent, disabled, and queer person about sexuality that might be more like relevant to me personally. And I also have lived experiences as a survivor of domestic violence and sexual assault. And a lot of my work revolves around addressing how systems respond to disabled survivors. And I think I mentioned that I'm kind of interested in the systems approach here. So that's the last bullet point. All right, so I wanted to start this off by taking a little bit of time to do a reflection activity. So I mentioned kind of a bit about my own background. You can drop this in the chat if you want to, or you can just think about it to yourself privately. There's no need to share it. I feel comfortable with that because I realize this is a personal topic. But think back to your sexuality education that you had as a young person. What sorts of values around sexuality did adults share with you? What was helpful to you? What was not helpful to you, or what do you wish had been different? And I realized that for some of this, maybe we didn't have anything told to us. And so maybe that's something to think about, is like, what did adults kind of share with you, and what sorts of values around sexuality did they share with you? I'll take maybe 2 minutes or so to do that. Thank you for all your thoughts and sharing. Yeah, Laura, I think you have access to the slides. Oh, maybe that's a different Laura, probably a different Laura. But yeah, I think someone can send them out as a PDF afterward. Yeah, I think there's a lot of kind of common themes emerging in what people are talking about. A lot of stuff about, kind of very rudimentary information, mostly sort of heterosexual, a lot of stuff about STIs and scaring people. All right, let's move on. So thank you everyone for sharing. So sexuality education in our society now. So the quality of sexuality education that you get depends a lot on where you live. Like I just moved from Oregon a couple of months ago. I live in Chicago now, but no, Oregon is I think one of the few states that actually does have some requirements that schools have to cover sexuality education. I think they have some standards around that. I think a lot of states don't have any, and so it's going to vary a lot depending on where you live. And of course, sexuality education tends to be tailored to a certain kind of demographic that is white, straight, cisgender, able-bodied, neurotypical, and so those views tend to inform the sorts of things that are talked about in sexuality education. And that's really important because like we're going to be focusing on disabled folks in this conversation here, but it's important to remember the intersection because people have many different identities that they can hold at the same time. And these things are interrelated because of the history of eugenics in this country, and with our society having a history of trying to prevent people who don't fit the mold that I mentioned earlier from participating in society as sexual beings. What this can look like even today now, where people might not use the word eugenics, these sorts of ideologies might still be popping up. You can see this with an emphasis on prevention and restriction, and when we see this with the sexuality that people with disabilities experience, a lot of focus on prevention and restriction, and also unfortunately there's forced sterilizations still do happen, and just in general a lot of denial of bodily autonomy. And so we'll be getting kind of into like how we can move toward a better sort of sexuality education in this workshop. All right, so sexuality education and disability. So as I was mentioning, sex ed for people with disabilities is usually about preventing some sort of unwanted outcome if they receive it at all. They might just be pulled out of those classes and just not get anything at all. And you see this really a lot in the research around sexuality education and disability, that there's a concern about, oh, these people are experiencing so much violence, so we got to give them sexuality education, or they're engaging in inappropriate sexual behaviors or whatever they're calling it. And so the focus is oftentimes on prevention, and not so much on helping people to live, fully dimensional sexual lives. You mentioned here some examples that could be like preventing sexual assault, preventing unwanted pregnancy, etc. And while prevention isn't necessarily bad, the problem is when that becomes the sole focus and what that can turn into a form of control. And then some of this focus on prevention and control that is oftentimes really heightened in the sexuality education of people with disabilities is by this assumption that disabled folks are childlike, or that they're just not interested or capable of having healthy sexual relationships. You see in the research on this, there's oftentimes the word hypersexual is used, or you might see the word paraphilia to describe someone's sexuality that otherwise we might just call it kink in other contexts, and otherwise kind of portraying the sexuality of people with disabilities as just being deviant in some way. And sort of along with that, there's oftentimes this assumption that because people with disabilities are childlike, that therefore they should not be able to understand their gender or their sexual orientation, so they're assumed to be straight and cisgender because of cis heteronormativity. And that another way that some biases about disability can show up in sexuality education is that, and again, I think I've seen this in research, unfortunately, is that a person's apparent lack of skill in some area around sexuality, if that person has a disability, it can sometimes be attributed to the disability itself, is this sort of unmutable innate quality that can't be improved upon with education. And that's really unfortunate, because then sometimes that can be a justification for not providing any education to people. And so that's also really important to be aware of, that all of these things are things that can happen, and biases that can occur around disability and sexuality education. So I've talked about prevention work a couple of times. The reason why sexuality education that is solely focused on preventing harm without looking at kind of the full dimensions of a person's, sexuality, why it can be harmful is that, this prevention and restriction itself can also be another form of harm to a person. And I give some examples of ways that can harm a person here. For instance, that if a person really wants to have a relationship, if they don't have support around how to do that in a safe and healthy manner, that might actually put them in more danger when they do try to go around their support persons or whatever systems are in place. If they're having to go around that to try to find relationships, that can be more dangerous. As well as that, messages that might not be intentional or otherwise, but telling people that sexuality is not for you, or can reinforce this idea that that a disabled person should be grateful if anyone shows attraction to them. And that's not a good situation to just start at when you're trying to negotiate a relationship with someone. And this is something I've experienced myself as a disabled autistic person. A lot of this sort of messaging that sometimes abusive partners might take advantage of that. And so that is really important to be aware of that kind of message, and how that can, I think, undermine a person's confidence in themselves. This sort of restriction and control also, it doesn't equip a person with the skills to know how to advocate for what they want, or to know when something is wrong. I think that learning how to do that is a pretty complex process, and that I think this is why I'll get into a little bit that teaching, consent and pleasure, and teaching people to identify what they do want is really important in being able to practice advocating. And as I mentioned earlier, this can make someone more vulnerable to exploitation. All right, so I think I talked about the normativity issue a little bit earlier on, that the cis heteronormativity and sort of the assumption that that sexuality education should be for white, cisgender, able-bodied, neurotypical folks. And so because of that, sexuality education can kind of have this assumption about what is and is not the accepted norm. This can show up in lots of different ways. We don't have time to kind of go into how that affects kind of everyone, but we'll kind of talk about more of like how that impacts disabled folks here. But for instance, disabled and neurodivergent people might experience sexuality differently due to, say, like physical or sensory differences. And sexuality education oftentimes doesn't address those sorts of things. And that, of course, is going to be really important for someone to know, like, how do you negotiate or talk about these sorts of things with a potential partner if you haven't had practice identifying that this is even a thing, or practicing how to talk about it. And with that, neurotypical norms around communication might just not work for neurodivergent people. And I think that something I've seen with a lot of sexuality curricula is that oftentimes they are based on trying to make neurodivergent people behave and communicate like neurotypical people, even if that just doesn't work for them. And I think that it can be really helpful to rethink, like, why are we doing this? What is the purpose of this? And also here, like someone's preferences around relationship structures might not fall within kind of like the straight cisgender monogamous norms, and those are generally also not addressed in sexuality education courses. Standards of attractiveness and beauty. This applies a lot with, I mean, kind of I think across the board with identities around like race and disability and neurodiversity. That standards of attractiveness and beauty tend to leave a lot of people out in sexuality education, and that's really important, is to kind of think about, like, are we telling people certain messages about who is and who's not attractive? All right. What is the purpose of sexuality education? And so here I'm going to kind of offer this as an alternative of kind of some things to kind of look at that I think would be, lovely if we could include these in our sexuality education. So I think that liberatory sexuality education examines the root of systemic oppression and how it shows up in sexuality education. And this means looking like how ableism and other forms of oppression are showing up in sexuality education, and thinking about the history of eugenics specifically and how that's showing up in sexuality education. Liberatory sexuality education means promoting autonomy, dignity of risk, and accessibility in sexuality education, so that it's including everybody. So it's not just some people that who get access to it, that everyone can access it. And as I mentioned earlier, pleasure and consent are really important in harm prevention. And also, I think a part of liberatory sexuality education means thinking about who is the keeper of knowledge. Is the dynamic where there is a professional educator who kind of gives information to, say, people who with lived experience from more marginalized backgrounds, or is it kind of, or are we able to kind of, like center like the lived experience of people with disabilities and other experiences of marginalization? And liberatory sexuality education is also about unpacking and examining these power dynamics in education, because that's also going to be really important for examining these power dynamics in sexuality and how that shows up. All right, and then I don't know if I have time to read off all 10 of the 10 principles of disability justice. I can just read the names of them, and then in the slides there will be like the link if you want to go and read more into these yourselves. But on this slide, I have an image of the 10 principles of disability justice by Sins Invalid, and I can read off the names of all 10 of them. The first is intersectionality. Second is leadership of those most impacted. The third is anti-capitalist politic. The fourth is commitment to cross-movement organizing. The fifth is recognizing wholeness. The sixth is sustainability. The seventh is commitment to cross-disability solidarity. The eighth is interdependence. The ninth is collective access. And the 10th is collective liberation. All right, and again, you can access this at www.sinsinvalid.org if you want to read more about them. They have quite a bit written about these 10 principles. And then on this slide, I have a slide of the ladder of citizen participation is what it's called, and there's 8 different steps on this ladder, and that are divided into non-participation, tokenism, and citizen power. And so at the bottom, starting off at the bottom with non-participation, it's manipulation, and then therapy, and then informing, consultation, placation, partnership, delegated power, and then finally citizen control. I know this uses the word citizen. We can think of this as kind of like any kind of like person who's part of like a marginalized group who's kind of potentially being controlled or kind of offered some sort of role in an environment. And we can think about this in terms of what role do people with disabilities have, say, in sexuality education curricula, for instance. All right, and then the last slide here I have is some action steps to think about. So here are some suggestions that I have for all of you. So listen to, follow, and learn from people with disabilities and compensate them, including disabled sex educators, and especially those who experience other forms of oppression besides ableism. And I think we have a couple of slides with some resources, and we have some sex educators listed in there that you can look up and follow if you're interested in them. Ask questions about sex ed curriculum, policies, and research about disability and sexuality. So for instance, you can ask who designed it, who was behind it, what role did people with disabilities have, like where would that fall on the ladder of citizen participation? And does it reflect the principles of disability justice? Like, are there some principles that are being left out? Are there some principles that it's in contradiction with? And what could be done to kind of bring it more into alignment with that? And the same for how can we make this so that people with disabilities have are higher on the ladder of participation rather than lower on it. All right, and then Katherine.
Do you mind sharing the slides still, Morrigan? Okay.
Yeah,
great.
just tell me next slide when you want me to advance.
All right, sounds good. Thank you. Yeah, so hi everyone, and thank you, Morrigan, for that. She and I met and talked about her doing sort of the bigger picture, and then I was going to get a little more practical. And just to tell you a little bit about me, I worked for Planned Parenthood of Northern New England in Keene, New Hampshire for 22 years. So right out of college, I started working for Planned Parenthood, and I was in the health center, and then I was an educator and trainer. And a couple of years into my work at Planned Parenthood, I experienced an accident and became a wheelchair user. So I have a spinal cord injury. And I started to notice that people were treating me really differently because I used a wheelchair. So I started to get a little more aware of disability issues now that I was part of this community. And at that same time, developmental disability agencies were reaching out to me, as well as special education teachers, asking me to help them address sexuality for students in high schools, but also adults in the community. And so both of those things kind of happened at the same time. So I became really interested in sexuality and disability for personal reasons, but also for professional reasons. And in 2006, I developed a curriculum, a sexuality education curriculum, specifically for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And as Morrigan was saying, I went to work with a group of self-advocates. So these are people who have intellectual developmental disabilities. And I said, there's not a lot of materials available now for people with disabilities, so I'm going to write a curriculum. And they said, hold on a second, nothing about us without us. Kind of woke me up. And they said, not only do we want to help design this curriculum, we also want to be one of the teachers of the curriculum as well. So that was a big, aha moment for me in my work, that maybe I didn't know everything that needed to be covered, and that we did want to talk to the people we were trying to reach and have them involved in that. So the curriculum was designed to be team taught between a self-advocate and a professional. And we recently updated it in 2018. But, like many curriculum, things evolve, things change, and we have to keep adapting and adding new topics and adding new language as well. So that was kind of the beginning of my work. And then about 5 years ago, I started doing this work full time. So most of my work had been at Planned Parenthood, and then just did the trainings and things on the side, but had full-time jobs. And then now I'm doing this full-time, which has been really amazing to be able to focus so much on this. And the name of my company is Elevatus Training. And we came up with this idea of elevating the status of people with disabilities. So elevate us. And so that's the business, and we focus on creating education materials as well as providing lots and lots of different trainings. You can go to the next slide. So we're going to get a little more practical maybe around, why is it important for social workers to address this topic, and some of the issues, there'll be some repetition with what Morrigan said. But if you could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So when I worked with self-advocates, I asked them, why do you want and need to learn about sexuality? And this is what they said: so we can learn to have healthy relationships, so we aren't lonely, which can be an issue for people with disabilities and feeling isolated. So we're able to make informed choices, so we can pick the right person for the toughest part of the relationship, making it last. So we can be safe, because we all have desires and needs, and that's okay. So that people know their rights, so that we can become sexual self-advocates and not just self-advocates. And many people that I've worked with say that when they bring up dating or, wanting to learn about sexuality, people get really nervous. But if they say, I want to get a job, or I'd like to live on my own, people are like, oh, great, let's figure out how you can do that, right? So there's much more comfort in that area. And they say it makes it more difficult for them to be sexual self-advocates because of the reaction that they get from professionals around them. So they're asking for sexuality education, and they're also asking professionals to help them and be able to address and support them in this way as well. So that's one of the reasons I think social workers can play a role in addressing sexuality. Next slide, Morrigan. There's also some self-advocates in Illinois who've been doing a lot of work around sexuality education. And here are some of their quotes. I want to know more so I can decide what's right for me, my body, my choice. I didn't receive any information in school or from my provider. I learned by the school of hard knocks. I'm still trying to work through the trauma of learning the hard way. And the last one, we had classes at the group home in the past, but it's been a long while. I can't remember what I learned. So people saying, not only do I want to make my own choices, but I want to have information, make informed choices. I also, don't want to learn by the school of hard knocks. Why not learn before and avoid some of the school of hard knocks as well? And that there's trauma related to that lack of information and being able to make those choices. And also that it can't just be a one-time thing. And we talk about that a lot around sexuality education with parents for their own kids. It's not the talk, there's many talks that people have throughout their lives around sexuality. And so providing sexuality education once, or, a series once, people are saying they want it more. And I also noticed when Morrigan asked about the values or the messages that you all received, somebody talked about, I can't remember exactly what it was. I'll think of it in a minute, but that it's biology focused versus relationships. There isn't enough education. So lots of pieces of what the self-advocates are saying. Also, many of us felt growing up about sexuality as well. Next slide. And this Laura Graham Holmes can tell you about this chart. And hopefully you'll share this whole document with everyone, but it's the Comprehensive Sexuality Education for Youth with Disabilities, a call to action. But this is, I think, really a powerful map when we look at the states that require that sexuality education is accessible to students with disabilities. So we have 5 states, and Virginia and Illinois just recently passed legislation. So it was 3 states probably 3 years ago. The dark blue are health education needs to be accessible to students with disabilities. And then the lighter blue is state provided resources. So just guidelines, but nothing's enforced through law. And I often, when I show this, I think, what would it be like if all of those were orange? That every state required that, one, that people had comprehensive, sex positive, inclusive, affirming sexuality education, but also included people with disabilities. Next slide. Okay, yeah, so California requires it, but does not find no inclusive accessible curriculum for blind students, right? So again, like Morrigan said that in the disability community, all means all. And my work has been developing a curriculum, but it was for a certain group of people with disabilities. So how do we move to the, another group of people with disabilities? And I had people in my training say, well, what about people who are non-speaking? Right, okay, so we developed some communication boards and cards so that people could participate in classes. And now we're adapting the curriculum for people with more severe disabilities or needing more time to process the information and the concepts. So there are a lot of statistics that are not, yes, every state, great, that are very negative. And on the one hand, Morrigan talked about, like, we don't want to just focus on all the prevention pieces. But I think it's important to know about the statistics because it does drive a lot of people's thinking around it. And we can support this, but also be proactive and positive and all of those other pieces as well. But there's a National Public Radio, there was a series, Abused and Betrayed. And what they did was they looked at national crime statistics, and they found that people with intellectual developmental disabilities were 7 times more likely to be abused than someone without disability. I think they also found that people with physical disabilities were 4 times more likely than someone without a disability. And if you look at women with intellectual developmental disabilities, they were 12 times more likely to be sexually abused. So pretty staggering statistics. There's also, you see here, I won't go through all of it, but just a higher rate of sexually transmitted infections among students in middle and high school with disabilities, as well as pregnancy too. So there are some statistics that are higher for this population, which can sometimes help with, funding and things as well. But it also can make us shift more to this prevention and more negativity than more sex positive too. So the statistics are a reason that we want to address this in any way that we can, in any role that we're in. And the next slide. And for me, it's like looking at the benefits of sexuality education and I work primarily with people with intellectual developmental disabilities. There are just so many benefits to it. And so if we look at the benefits, that self-advocates feel empowered and make decisions about what they want in their lives, like, yes, right? We reduce abuse, charges of sex crimes, loneliness, sexual behaviors at work, unplanned pregnancy, sexually transmitted infections. Right, great. Increased connection and healthy relationships. So people are part of communities, part of work environments, and they're having more connection and belonging in their lives. And we're making the difference in the lives of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And really the cons are about us. If we're in a professional role, that we might feel uncomfortable, like maybe no one talked to us or we didn't get positive messages. Or people might get a little bit upset with us because we're addressing this topic. But when I look at that difference between the pros versus the cons, when we're really serving people, it's, if we're really going to serve the people we're working with, then we want to provide sexuality education because there's so many benefits. And I'm willing to deal with the awkwardness and the uncomfortableness, and maybe people being a little bit annoyed with me because the positives are so high. So that's one way to think about it. And the next slide, I'm just going to give a few tips. And I know Morrigan also, they gave some tips as well. But giving positive messages, even if we don't have all the answers, we can say, great question. I'm so glad you asked that. Sort of like when the self-advocates say that the reaction they get is more negative when they bring up dating, like, great, let's talk about it. So giving those positive messages. And, as a culture, we give many negative messages, and that was brought up earlier as well. But also, if you've seen the movie Mean Girls, the gym teacher says, if you have sex, you will get chlamydia and you will die, right? So we want to give positive ones. And we want to give inclusive messages as well. And Morrigan mentioned that before. And then also make sure that your materials are cognitively accessible. And that means using plain language and being concrete about what we're talking about. And sometimes with sexuality, it's a lot of abstract concepts. And so we have to get very concrete about what we're teaching. We want to share information and facts and not our values. And I'll just talk a little bit about that. But I'm sure as social workers, you know all about values and being aware of your values and setting them aside. But it's also good to know what your biases are around disability and sexuality too. And a lot of the work I do, I focus on supporting others and being strong sexual self-advocates. So I'm going to talk about that as well. So this next part is just the values. I'll briefly talk about that, but just make sure you're aware of your values and attitudes regarding sexuality and people with disabilities. And if we go to the next slide, you can see some different values, and just thinking, what do I believe? Is it okay for a 16-year-old to have sexual intercourse? Is it okay for a person with a vulva to have many sex partners? Is it okay for a person to masturbate? So we've got all of these different scenarios. An 18-year-old to watch pornography, someone to identify as non-binary and be referred to as they, a person with a penis to wear women's clothes. Right? So where are there places where we have some bias? And then what about disability? If you layer disability on top of these, is it different or is it the same? And why or why not? And really the only one that lists disability is the last one, and 2 people with disabilities having a child. And what are our feelings about that as well? So think about your values around this topic too, because I know that you're all good at that. Anyway, you can go to the next slide. And, as I'm sure you know, sort of rolling it back to the person rather than sharing our values. So we're going to leave them at the door. We're going to set them aside. There's a great group called Cardia Training, and they talk about stop, drop, and roll. So if you feel like your buttons are being pushed or your values are being pushed, you can stop, take a deep breath, drop any story or assumption you have about that scenario, and roll it back to them. And oftentimes I'll say, I'll do things like, some people believe this, some people believe this. What do you think? So sort of rolling it back. And so just giving facts and checking in with ourselves too, like, is that always true? And I tell a story about my daughter when she was little on the playground. A little girl said, when you grow up, no, you have to be married to make a baby. And my daughter said, no, you don't have to be married to make a baby. Right? So just those sort of that fact versus values, like my daughter was being very factual. And this other girl probably thought it was a fact, because someone said to her, when you grow up, you'll get married and then you'll have a baby. And so she thought it was fact. So she was very upset. Yeah. Thanks, Gabriel. Yes. So paying attention to, is it really facts that I'm giving, or is it really beliefs that I just feel so strongly about that I think they're facts? All right, next slide. And the group of self-advocates that I work with, they came up with a much broader definition of what sexual self-advocacy is. But I think for people with disabilities, it's really 2 parts. One is saying, hello, I'm a sexual person. I want to be in a, so one is sort of getting people's attention that this is something that you want in your life. Where people without disabilities, there's sort of this assumption that maybe not everyone, but most people will be in a sexual romantic relationship some point in their lives. Parents and teenagers might disagree on when that should start, but in general, we sort of assume that. But with disability, we do the exact opposite. So sometimes being a strong sexual self-advocate is saying, I want this in my life. This is important to me. I want to learn about sexuality. So this is kind of a summary. So it's speaking up for yourself sexually, getting information, taking a stand, saying to whoever, this is my choice, stating your sexual limits and desires with your partner, respecting others' limits and desires, starting to do what you want with relationships. So it's really 2 parts for people with disabilities. being recognized as a sexual being, and then being able to speak up within your relationship. All right, next slide. And I've just got a few more slides, I think. But one of the things that I've noticed when working with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities is I can give them all kinds of information or help them learn about different things. But if they don't have certain beliefs, they won't access that information. So if they don't believe that their life is their own and their body is their own and they get to decide what's right for them, you can give them all the information in the world. But if they don't have that core belief, it really impacts them being able to speak up when something doesn't feel right, or speaking up for something they want in their lives. But also knowledge and skills. So I'll talk a little bit about these and go to the next slide. So just kind of checking in, do people really believe this, and seeing if they believe, do you believe all? I will talk to self-advocates and say, here are some different beliefs. Are there any that you struggle with? Or do you believe all of these? Just so we're aware that, like, having this sense of being in charge of your life and self-determination and making your own choices is an important piece. And in the curriculum, I use an activity called the name tag game, where people put their name tags on the right or the left. And I say, that's right, it's your body. You get to decide where your name tag goes. And then the next week, kind of reinforce that. And then the next week, I say, you know what, I'm the teacher. Or you can say, I'm the social worker. I think you should move your name tag. And they usually do. And I say, wait, no, who gets to decide? And it takes about 10 weeks for people to actually say no to me. But we want to teach non-compliance, right? And people with disabilities are often taught to comply, do what you're supposed to do. And so how do we teach non-compliance as well? So I think believing that you have the right to say no and to speak up or to say yes is an important piece of that. Okay, we can go to the next one, which I think is just looking at the, more of these positive messages that we have and feel in our lives. And then the next slide is just really looking at a self-advocate. Do you believe these or not? And then family members and professionals, how can you make sure that the people we care for firmly believe that it's their body and they get to decide what's right for them? So what are some ways that we can do that? So that's the belief piece. And then knowledge, we go to the next slide. There's so many things for all of us to learn around sexuality, and we're not done at 18, right? It's throughout our whole lives we're learning about sexuality. So here are just some different topics that are important for people to learn. And then on the next slide, I have some resources too, and these are specific for self-advocates. So there's an Organization for Autism Research. It's a sex ed guide for self-advocates. Also, Elevatus Training, we have a resource page that has lots of tips and tools for talking and teaching about sexuality. But also there's the Organization for Autism Research also has a podcast. So if someone isn't a strong reader, they can listen to the episodes. And there's also a Sex Talk for Self-Advocate webinar series. And then the last one is Sex Ed for People with IDD, and it was created by people with IDD for people with IDD. And they're short videos on different topics around sexuality, but you see that the self-advocate is the teacher here. So that piece about citizen control and leading the way are part of some of these resources too. And then Morrigan, you had some the next slide, I think, are your different.
Yeah, and these are Sexuality Liberators and Movers Conference is a conference I've attended a couple of times. I think a few times they've had some workshops about disability and sexuality, but their primary focus is like a BIPOC sexuality conference, and so it's really great for that. And like I highly recommend it, as I mentioned, because there's some kind of shared history of like different oppressed, populations around sexuality because of the history of eugenics. So some of these things apply across communities, and of course because people have many different identities, and a lot of attention to disability is also oftentimes focused on white disabled people. And so it is really important to learn about sexuality from BIPOC sex educators, Sins Invalid, and then all of these have links if you had like the PDF of it. Sins Invalid, so the link like where I was showing you the 10 principles of disability justice, and then these other people that I have on here, these are other like places where you can go to find folks who write or who do education around sexuality, and that are this inclusive of disability, and most of them, I believe, identify with at least one disability themselves. So
thank you. All right, the next slide. And then I think, so we talked about beliefs and knowledge, and then there's skills and really helping people practice speaking up for what they want in their lives and advocating for what they want. And how do you speak up to your own parents? And how do you speak up to staff that are supporting you or professionals in your life? And so practice makes us better when we're speaking up. And so I think anytime we talk about, we really want to focus on beliefs and knowledge, and also practicing and skills. And the next slide are just some tips for talking with parents and professionals that we can certainly teach around how do you speak up for yourself. But I want to go to the next slide and just quickly talk about a couple of projects that I'm working on and that self-advocates are taking the lead here. So the Michigan project, we worked there for 3 years, training self-advocate professional teams. And now throughout most of Michigan, I don't know if anyone's from Michigan or knows Michigan, but there's that Upper Peninsula. But most of the whole state, except for way up in the Upper Peninsula, people can receive sexuality education when they have a disability, and the teacher, one of the teachers is a self-advocate and one is a professional. So they have about 25 teams now throughout the state. New York, we're also doing some work around self-advocacy and sexual self-advocacy, and I'm working with SANIes, which is Self-Advocates New York State, and they are we're in the process of creating a kind of mini curriculum for them to use throughout the state of New York. And then I do a lot of work with self-advocates at the National Association for Councils on Developmental Disability. We do workshops, and I find that in the beginning, it was more sort of team teaching, and that I'm sort of stepping back or rolling back, shall I say. And the self-advocates are really coming forward and taking the lead. So it is happening. And similar to when I first went to self-advocates and they said nothing about us without us, they also, said, we want to be one of the teachers. And here they are taking the lead. So it's really exciting. And then the last thing, and this also comes from self-advocates, is sexual rights. So if we go to the next slide, Morrigan. And these came from self-advocates. I have the right to say what happens to and with my body. I have the right to privacy and showing and sharing my sexuality. So lots of different rights, and then speaking up for those rights. I have the right to explore and to say if I'm a man, woman, a combination, or neither. I have the right to make my own choices about my sexuality. So really speaking up for what they need and their sexual rights. And then the next slide, I just something to consider is, are we honoring people with disabilities' sexual rights? Are we giving privacy and choice and respect and pleasure and acceptance and all of these pieces? And I want to show a video just because it's like my favorite video right now. And it's really addresses the right to privacy for people with disabilities. So I think we can just play it. I don't know if you might have to set the sound on your computer, Morrigan.
oh yeah, I might need to stop the share for that then.
Yeah.
And then let's see.
Just the two of us. We can make it if we try. Just the two of us, you and I see the crystal raindrops fall and the beauty of it all. And when the sun comes shining through, just the two of us. We can make it if we try. Just the two of us, you and I. I wanna be the one. I wanna be the one with you.
So I'll leave you thinking about that, but lots of well-meaning people, right? Supporting people, but not giving the privacy and the space to actually explore one's sexuality as well. Great. So I think that we're done with our part, and I think Laura's gonna, I'm glad you liked it, talk about or pose some questions, and we'll get some discussion going. Thanks, everybody.